party hums with voices, a sea of faces moving through warm light and laughter. You stand at the edge, drink in hand, watching the dance of human connection unfold. Everyone seems to know their place in this intricate social ballet. Yet in this crowded room of selves, you feel an invisible wall between you and everyone else. It's not that you're physically alone. You're surrounded by people, by sound, by life. But there's a quiet ache, a hollow space that the noise cannot fill. This is the invisible mirror, the one we carry within us, reflecting not what we are, but what we fear we might be. The parts of ourselves we've learned to hide, to deny, to push into shadow. Carl Jung called this our shadow self, the repository of all we consider unacceptable, unlovable, or dangerous. But here's the paradox. The more we try to hide these parts, the more they shape our experience of the world. The invisible mirror doesn't show us our reflection as we wish to be seen. It shows us what we refuse to acknowledge. And in that refusal, we create the very loneliness we seek to escape. Have you ever noticed how the people who trigger you most deeply often reflect the qualities you most fear in yourself? The colleague whose ambition feels threatening, the friend whose neediness makes you uncomfortable, the lover whose vulnerability scares you. These aren't random irritations. They're messages from the shadow, knocking at the door of your awareness. The invisible mirror is always present, even when we're not looking. In the quiet moments between conversations, when the laughter fades and you're left with only your thoughts, what do you see in that dark glass? What parts of yourself have you exiled to preserve the image of who you think you should be? The unseen shadow is indeed the loudest voice we carry. It speaks through our attractions and aversions, through the people we choose and the ones we avoid, through the longing that persists even when we have everything we thought we wanted. This is where our journey begins, not in changing who we are, but in learning to see what we've been unwilling to look at. In the crowded room of our own psyche, what voices have we been trying to silence? Shadow projection is psychology's most elegant and painful paradox. We take the parts of ourselves we cannot bear to acknowledge, our anger, our neediness, our selfishness, our fear, and we unconsciously project them onto others. It's a brilliant defense mechanism, really. By seeing these qualities in other people, we can maintain the fiction of our own purity. We can point fingers, judge, criticize, all while remaining blind to the fact that what we're rejecting in them is actually what we're rejecting in ourselves. Jung described this process with poetic precision. Everything that irritates us about others can lead us to an understanding of ourselves. But we rarely follow that lead. Instead, we build walls against the very qualities that could teach us about our own wholeness. The invisible mirror works in two directions. When we look at others, we see our own shadow reflected back. When we look inward, we see only what we've been conditioned to accept as good or acceptable. The rest gets pushed into darkness. This creates a fundamental split in our consciousness. We become strangers to ourselves, living in a house where certain rooms are permanently locked. We decorate the visible rooms beautifully, but always sense the presence of those closed doors. The longing we feel isn't just for connection with others. It's for connection with the missing parts of ourselves. The loneliness isn't about being physically alone. It's about being psychologically fragmented. Think about your most significant relationships, the ones that ended painfully, the ones that felt inexplicably magnetic, the ones that triggered deep emotional responses. Each of these is a reflection in the invisible mirror. When we fall in love with someone who embodies qualities we've disowned in ourselves, we're trying to complete ourselves through another person. when we feel intense dislike for someone, we're often reacting to the shadow qualities we fear we possess. This isn't to say that all attraction and aversion is projection, but the most powerful emotional responses often point directly to our shadow material. The setup for loneliness begins early. As children, we learn which parts of ourselves are acceptable and which are not. We learn to hide our anger, our sadness, our fear. We learn that certain needs make us needy and certain desires make us selfish. These lessons create the foundation for the invisible mirror. We internalize the critical voices of parents, teachers, society, until they become our own. We learn to police ourselves, to hide what might be rejected. And so, the shadow grows. Not because these qualities are inherently bad, but because we've been taught they're unacceptable. The very process of trying to be good creates the darkness we then fear. Let's walk deeper into the psychology of the invisible mirror. The mechanism of shadow projection follows a precise, if unconscious, pattern. First, we encounter a quality in ourselves that conflicts with our self-image. Perhaps it's jealousy when a friend succeeds, or anger when we feel powerless, or neediness when we want to appear strong. This creates cognitive dissonance, the uncomfortable gap between who we believe we are and who we actually are in moments of raw emotion. To resolve this discomfort, our psyche does something remarkable. It externalizes the conflict. We don't say, "I feel jealous." We say, "They're being arrogant." We don't acknowledge, "I'm feeling needy." We think, "They're being distant." The shadow quality gets projected outward, where we can safely criticize it without having to own it. This is where attachment theory intersects with shadow work. Our earliest relationships teach us what is safe to express and what must be hidden. If crying was met with comfort, tears remain part of our emotional vocabulary. If anger was punished, rage gets buried in shadow. The invisible mirror becomes a relational compass, guiding us toward people who will reflect back the version of ourselves we want to see. We seek partners who validate our persona, the mask we present to the world, while avoiding those who might trigger our shadow. But here's the catch: the shadow doesn't disappear when we ignore it. It grows stronger in darkness, emerging in indirect ways. Through passive aggression instead of direct communication. Through subtle criticism instead of honest feedback. Through emotional withdrawal instead of vulnerable sharing. The loneliness we experience in relationships often stems from this indirect communication. We're not showing our whole selves, so we can't receive whole acceptance. We're offering only the polished version, then wondering why the connection feels superficial. Think about the last time you felt truly seen by someone. What made it different? Likely, it was their willingness to see beyond your persona, to acknowledge both your light and your shadow without judgment. This is the healing power of authentic connection. When someone sees our shadow and doesn't recoil, it gives us permission to see it ourselves. The invisible mirror becomes less frightening when we realize the reflection isn't monstrous, just human. The exploration of shadow projection reveals another layer. We often project not just negative qualities, but positive ones too. The talents we admire in others but deny in ourselves. The courage we see in friends but feel we lack. The creativity we celebrate in artists but suppress in our own lives. This golden shadow, the disowned positive qualities, contributes to feelings of inadequacy and imposter syndrome. We look at others and think, they're so talented, brave, creative, never realizing we're seeing reflected back the parts of ourselves we haven't yet claimed. The work of shadow integration isn't about becoming perfect. It's about becoming whole. It's about reclaiming the exiled parts of ourselves so we can show up more authentically in relationships. This process requires courage. It means looking directly into the invisible mirror and saying, "Yes, that too is me." The jealousy, the neediness, the anger, the fear, they're not enemies to be defeated, but messengers trying to deliver important information. When we stop projecting our shadow onto others, something remarkable happens. Our relationships transform. We stop expecting others to carry our emotional baggage. We stop blaming them for triggering feelings that were already present within us. We begin to relate from a place of wholeness rather than fragmentation. And in that wholeness, genuine connection becomes possible. There comes a moment in every psychological journey when insight shifts from intellectual understanding to emotional truth. This is the reflection phase, where we stop analyzing the invisible mirror and start seeing what's actually reflected in it. For me, this moment came during a period of intense loneliness. I had everything society told me should make me happy: friends, career success, romantic relationships. Yet, I felt profoundly alone, as if I were watching my life through glass. The breakthrough happened when I stopped asking, "Why am I so lonely?" and started asking, "What parts of myself am I refusing to keep company with?" The answer was uncomfortable. I was lonely because I had abandoned myself. I had created an elaborate persona of competence and independence, while secretly feeling needy and uncertain. I projected this neediness onto partners, then criticized them for being too dependent. The reflection in the invisible mirror showed me a truth I had been avoiding. My longing for connection was actually a longing for self-acceptance. I wanted others to love the parts of myself I couldn't love. This is the emotional core of shadow work. It's not about fixing what's broken, but about welcoming home the exiled parts of ourselves. It's about sitting with our own loneliness until we realize it's not about being alone, but about being disconnected from ourselves. Think about your own moments of loneliness. What were you really longing for? Was it truly another person's presence? Or was it permission to be fully yourself? To express the emotions you usually suppress, to acknowledge the needs you usually deny? The reflection phase requires tenderness. We're not confronting enemies, we're reuniting with lost parts of ourselves. The anger we've projected onto others is often just unmet need. The jealousy is unexpressed desire. The criticism is unacknowledged insecurity. When we approach our shadow with compassion rather than judgment, something shifts. The invisible mirror becomes less threatening. We start to see that the qualities we've been hiding are actually sources of depth and authenticity. Our vulnerability becomes strength. Our neediness becomes capacity for intimacy. Our anger becomes healthy boundaries. Our fear becomes wisdom. This doesn't happen overnight. It's a gradual process of turning toward ourselves with the same kindness we would offer a dear friend. Of saying, "I see that part of you, and you're welcome here." The reflection in the invisible mirror begins to change as we change our relationship to it. What once seemed monstrous becomes human. What once felt shameful becomes understandable. What once triggered avoidance now invites curiosity. This is where loneliness transforms from a problem to be solved into a doorway to deeper self-understanding. The ache we feel isn't a sign that something is wrong with us, but that something within us is asking to be seen. Integration is not the absence of shadow, but the presence of wholeness. The invisible mirror doesn't disappear when we face it. It becomes transparent. We see through it to the truth of our own complexity. The resolution of this psychological journey isn't a final destination, but a new way of traveling. We learn to carry our shadows with us, not as burdens, but as companions on the path of becoming. The loneliness that once felt like a prison becomes a sacred space for self-discovery. The longing that drove us outward turns inward, where it finds the connection we were seeking all along. This doesn't mean we no longer need others, quite the opposite. When we stop projecting our shadow onto relationships, we can show up more authentically. We can love and be loved for who we truly are, not just for the persona we present. The crowded room of selves becomes less intimidating when we realize everyone carries their own invisible mirror. The judgments we fear from others are often just echoes of the judgments we level at ourselves. The resolution is quiet, like dawn after a long night. There's no dramatic transformation, just a gradual softening. The edges between light and shadow blur until we recognize they were never separate to begin with. We begin to understand that the parts of ourselves we tried to hide were actually our greatest teachers. The jealousy taught us about our desires. The anger taught us about our boundaries. The neediness taught us about our capacity for connection. The invisible mirror becomes a tool for self-awareness rather than self-criticism. We learn to look at our reflections with curiosity instead of judgment. To ask, what is this feeling trying to tell me? Rather than, why am I feeling this way? This shift changes everything. Relationships become opportunities for growth rather than sources of validation. Loneliness becomes solitude, a choice rather than a sentence. The longing transforms from ache to anticipation. We realize that the wholeness we sought in others was always available within, not as perfection, but as acceptance. Not as the absence of shadow, but as the integration of all our parts. The final realization is perhaps the simplest. We were never broken. We were just fragmented. And the work of becoming whole isn't about adding anything new, but about welcoming home what was always there. The invisible mirror remains, but now we see it clearly. It reflects not what we lack, but what we contain. Not what we should be, but what we are. And in that clear reflection, we find the connection we were seeking all along, not with some idealized version of ourselves, but with the beautifully complex, shadow and light human being we've always been.